You ever sit back and wonder how a single life can change the entire course of human history? Tonight, we travel into a world where the winds never stop blowing, where the horizon stretches further than the eye can see, and where survival is earned in blood, in loyalty, and in the rhythm of a galloping horse. This isn't just the story of a conqueror. It's the saga of how a child, born with nothing, rose to command the greatest land empire the world has ever known. The journey begins across the vast steppes of Mongolia. Picture the grasslands at dusk, windswept and endless, painted gold by the fading sun. The year was around 1162. In a small, fragile yurt, a child was born clutching a blood clot in his tiny hand, an omen, a sign that his life would be marked by violence and destiny. His father, Yasugai, a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, and his mother, Holan, could not have imagined the weight this child would carry. They named him Temujin, after a defeated enemy chief, a name born of war. But Mongolia in that age was no kingdom, no unified nation. It was a brutal mosaic of tribes, Tatars, Merkits, Naimans, and countless others endlessly locked in cycles of raiding, betrayal, and shifting alliances. In this unforgiving world, the only law was strength. Winters froze men where they stood, summers scorched the earth into dust, and survival depended on herds that could vanish overnight. From his earliest days, Temujin's childhood was shaped by hardship. He learned to ride before most children could walk, gripping the mane of a pony as his mother shouted encouragement across the open plains. By the time he could hold a bow, he was already shooting from horseback, the arrows whistling through the air with deadly precision. Hunger was his teacher, endurance was his companion. Yet even in this land where survival was cruel, Temujin's life would take an even darker turn. When he was only 9 years old, his father took him to the family of his betrothed, Borta, to fulfill Mongolian custom. It was supposed to be the beginning of his path to manhood, but fate intervened. On his way home, Yasugai accepted food from enemies, the Tatars. They recognized him, poisoned him, and left him to die. As he lay fading, he sent word for Temujin to return, but the damage was done. With their leader gone, the clan abandoned the family. The people who had once shared meals in their tent turned their backs and stripped them of everything: their herds, their protection, their future. The words they left behind still cut like a blade. The deepest water dries up, the brightest stone crumbles. Temujin's mother, Holan, stood tall against despair. She gathered her children and taught them the ways of survival on the margins of society: roots, berries, scraps of meat from marmots and fish that became their diet. To keep warm, they stitched together the skins of field mice. Imagine that. A future ruler of millions, wrapped in scraps no bigger than a palm. Holan instilled a single lesson: unity was survival. One arrow breaks easily, she told them, but many together cannot be broken. But hardship breeds conflict. At the age of 12, Temujin killed his half-brother Bekta in a quarrel over food, a crime among the Mongols as grave as any fratricide. Yet in this brutal act he asserted dominance, proving that leadership demanded ruthlessness, even against kin. Not long after, his family's enemies, the Taichi Ud clan, captured him. They shackled him with a wooden collar, parading him from yurt to yurt as if he were nothing more than a spectacle. For days he endured humiliation, treated as less than human. But even in chains, Temujin's spirit would not bend. One night, during a drunken celebration, he shattered the collar against a rock and escaped into the darkness. Pursuers hunted him like an animal. One man, Sokan Shira, spotted him hiding in a river, and in a twist of fate, he chose mercy, sparing the boy's life. Mercy, a rare thing on the steppe. Temujin would never forget it. Years later, when power was finally his, he repaid Sokan Shira's kindness with rewards and protection, even in a world of cruelty, he remembered. Reunited with his family, Temujin turned toward rebuilding his future. He sought out Borte, his betrothed, and their marriage cemented an alliance with her tribe, the Kongirad. As a wedding gift, he received a black sable coat, a treasure beyond measure. But to Temujin, it was not wealth. It was a key. He carried it to Togrul, the Khan of the Karaites, once a sworn ally of his late father. Offering the sable coat, Temujin declared, "I will be your right hand. Together we will unite the felt tent people." It was a bold promise, a spark that would ignite the steppe. Yet no alliance was safe from vengeance. The Merkit, who had once abducted Temujin's mother, raided his camp and seized Borte. For Temujin, this was more than personal. It was a challenge to his very survival. Rallying his allies, including Togrul and his childhood companion, Yamuka, he launched his first military campaign. Against all odds, he rescued Borte after months of captivity. But when she returned, she carried a child, a boy who bore the shadow of uncertain paternity. Temujin, with a cold practicality that would define his rule, accepted the child, Yochi, as his own. Bloodlines mattered less to him than loyalty and unity. And so, a new way of leadership began to take shape. He built his circle not by blood, but by proof. The old way said birth decided rank. The new way, his way, said skill and loyalty decided everything. Men from minor clans, men with no famous fathers, even men taken from defeated camps, found a place near his fire if they could endure the cold and keep their word. The sable coat had opened one door, the promise of fair reward opened 1,000 more. Word spread across the grass. Under Arslan, a brave rider could rise. It was this rising strength that strained the bond with Kadan, the sworn brother who led by custom and pedigree. Two paths slowly pulled apart, the old path of noble houses and the new path of earned trust. When the split became open rivalry, followers chose sides. Years turned into a long struggle of raids, ambushes, and night councils under the stars. Arslan lost a great clash at the Three Rivers, but he did not throw lives into a hopeless stand. He pulled back, healed the wounded, and made new pacts with those who disliked Kadan's pride. Ordu of the Karaite wavered, then schemed, then became an obstacle. Arslan treated him as he treated all obstacles, with patience, until patience cost too much, and then with final force. By the spring, when the mountain snows melted and the larks returned, the steppes had changed. Tents that once answered to 12 banners now faced one. At a grand gathering near the sacred ridge of Bokan Khaldun, the chiefs raised Arslan on a felt carpet and hailed him as the ocean-wide ruler. He did not smile. He listened. He made oaths. He set to work. The first work was law. He gave the realm a rule set plain enough for herders, strict enough for warriors, and broad enough to hold many tribes in one tent. Theft, false witness, the killing of envoys all carried heavy punishments. Plunder was counted and divided by rule, not whim. Women taken in war were to be guarded, not abused. Messengers were sacred. The law bound friend and former foe alike, and because it bound him too, men believed it. The second work was order in war. He cut across bloodlines with a clean knife, grouping riders by tens, hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s. Leaders rose by results. A quiet archer who never missed might outrank a noble born to command. This angered some old families, but the army moved like a single creature, now fast, flexible, and calm under pressure. Each man kept spare bows, a whetstone, dry meat, a kettle. Each man watched the others, for in that army, failing a comrade could cost a life. The third work was speed. The horse lines grew long. A rider might have 5 mounts, all trained to breathe and turn as one. Without heavy carts, without slow baggage trains, the column slipped through valleys, crossed rivers at night, and appeared where no scout expected them. Fires lit on distant hills carried signals. Arrow messengers crossed a day's ride in half that time. The Yam station's simple post houses with fodder, water, and fresh horses turned a wild land into a living road. With home united, Arslan looked outward. The first test came against the Tangut to the southwest, a trading realm of walled towns that guarded mountain passes. A raid became a plan became a siege. Rivers were turned from their beds to drown a stubborn gate. When the Tangut bowed, they sent troops and tribute rather than face more ruin. The next great wall was the Jin in the north of China. There, numbers could not save defenders who could not move. At Yuling, the larger host broke apart, chasing a retreat that was not a retreat, only bait. When the circle closed, the riders cut from the edges inward until the shouting stopped. The Jin capital starved behind thick walls and fell when there was nothing left to eat but surrender. Even as towers burned in the east, riders pushed west. The Karakitai, who had ruled much of the Middle Lands, found themselves squeezed by force and by politics. Arslan's bowman general, the arrow, listened more than he spoke, and he listened well. Local princes who feared their own masters quietly opened gates. A great state folded, not only from steel, but from small deals made in dark tents. Behind these victories stood more than arrows. Terror was used with care, like fire. Too much, and it burns the user the right amount, and it clears the field. Towns that resisted were broken with harsh examples. Towns that yielded were spared and taxed. Word moved faster than horses. Submit and live. Resist and be erased. Smiths, carpenters, papermakers, weavers, skilled hands were gathered and sent east or west where the empire needed them. In this, Arslan was cold but consistent. He did not waste talent. He redirected it. Then came the insult that changed the map. Seeking open trade with the great realm of the sunset, Arslan sent a caravan 450 souls, guarded by trust and the law of envoys. At Otrar, a greedy governor called the merchants spies, seized their goods and killed them. A second mission, formal and highborn, met the same fate. Beards burned, envoys executed. For a ruler who held messengers as sacred, this was not just a slight. It was a curse cast against the order of the sky. He withdrew alone to a high ridge for 3 days. When he came down, his voice was level. The youngest son would rule the cities of the insulted lands, but only after those cities learned what it meant to offend the riders of the grass. The host that rode west may have been the largest the steppe had ever called. Perhaps 200,000 under many banners, seasoned men, clear-eyed captains, sons who were learning by doing, Yalin the calm, Chagai the strict, Oged the careful, Tuli the unbreakable. Their foe, the Shah of the Sunset Realm, had more soldiers on paper, but he spread them thin across many walls, trusting stones more than plans. Stones cannot think. Otrar fell first. The governor who began the chain of blood died by molten silver, a death that matched his hunger for metal. Bukhara opened next. Arslan rode his horse into the great mosque. Nay, not to mock the faith, but to show the city that the old order was over. He demanded treasure from those who had hidden it, then used Bukhara's people as human screens when moving on Samarkand. The sight of neighbors marching ahead of foreign riders broke courage more surely than any speech. Samarkand's mercenaries begged to surrender apart from the citizens. They were cut down to show that selling a sword carried its own risk. Artisans were counted by the thousands and sent away. The rest, many of them, never left the fields where they knelt. The Shah ran instead of rallying. Two captains, the Arrow and the Iron Wolf, hunted him like a shadow across deserts and islands until he died alone, wrapped not in silk, but in fear. His death did not end the burning. At Gurganj, the defenders fought like cornered wolves. The river was turned to flood the streets. When the gates fell, numbers were assigned for killing, so that rage did not become random. At Nishapur, a revolt that took the life of a son-in-law brought a fury that spared nothing with a heartbeat. The numbers told by later writers may swell with grief, but the ground itself remembers. Canals broken, fields gone to dust, cities that turned to heaps and never rose again. Yet even in this storm the pattern held. Submit early, and a city kept its shrines and scholars. Step forward with a holy man's staff instead of a spear, and the staff would not be struck. Loot came by measure. Cruelty, when ordered, served purpose, not its entertainment. It was a cold logic. Break resistance fast, then tax what remains. When the main army turned east again, a smaller force kept riding up through the passes of the Caucasus, down to the plains where Slavic princes gathered, and out to the Crimean shore. It was called scouting, but it looked like fate doing practice runs for the years ahead. A 9-day feigned flight drew a proud host into a trap by the Kalka River. When the riders turned, the trap closed like a jaw. All the while, the empire tied itself together in ways no one had seen before. Post stations dotted the roads. Seals of authority, small and heavy, opened doors and granaries. A girl with a gold coin on her head, so people whispered, could walk from sunrise to sunset lands and not be touched. Paper money in the east, written orders in the center, and caravans that no longer had to bribe a dozen petty lords along the way. These were victories too, only quieter. But the bowstring hum never stopped. There was still the old quarrel with the Jinn, still the Tangut who had bent but not always obeyed, still the task of turning tribes into a state that could outlive a single will. In the council circle, old scars were covered by new plans. Yalin watched the western edge. Chagai checked the ranks like a stone judge. Oged weighed costs. Tuli kept the heart of the army beating, and Arslan, who had once worn mouse skin for warmth, looked from one horizon to the other and saw work left in both directions. He remembered those who had chosen mercy, Soran, who kept silent by the river's reeds when a boy shivered in mud and moonlight. He remembered those who had chosen betrayal, Kadan, great friend and great rival, who later asked for a death without blood and was given one, his back broken as a prince's due. He remembered a child with a blood clot in his fist, a mother sewing scraps into a coat, a sable gift traded for an oath, and he held to the same line: unity, speed, law, reward, and fear, each in its proper place. Beyond the grasslands, walled worlds thought they understood power. Soon they would learn that power could move faster than news, arrive before rumors, and leave only hoofprints and new rules behind. The storm over the west was not just fire and steel, it was memory, spreading in whispers from broken survivors. They come as shadows, some said, and when they leave, nothing stands but bones and silence. In markets from Damascus to Delhi, merchants spoke of molten silver poured into eyes, of entire cities erased in days, of rivers running red. And yet those same merchants found themselves drawn into the web of roads now guarded by a single power. Trade caravans that once paid a dozen tolls could now cross half a continent under one authority. Fear and profit mixed in every breath, as if the horseman carried ruin in one hand and opportunity in the other. When Arslan returned eastward, his gaze turned again to China. The Jin still stood, weakened but not shattered. Their walls were tall, their soldiers many, their resources vast. But their confidence had cracked. Every defeat, every surrender of a town spread doubt like a sickness among them. In 1215, the capital of Zhongdu, today's Beijing, faced the riders. Siege engines thundered against its gates. Hunger tightened its grip inside. When the city finally fell, the slaughter was terrible, deliberate, and total. Officials were cut down, granaries emptied, palaces stripped bare. Refugees carried tales across the land. The city's fat melted on the streets, making them slick with death. This was no accident. It was a message. Defiance had a cost too heavy to bear. Yet in the midst of horror, there was calculation. Scholars were spared if they could serve. Craftsmen were measured and relocated. Engineers from captured towns were set to work designing new siege towers and engines. Each conquest was not only destruction, it was absorption. Knowledge flowed into the empire like tributaries into a river, feeding its future campaigns. Arslan's genius was not only on the battlefield, but in his ability to see connections where others saw divisions. A Chinese engineer could be placed alongside a Persian builder, both under the protection of Mongol law, both serving a vision greater than their former masters had ever allowed. What bound them was not loyalty to a tribe or religion, but the Khan's will, the same will that had once sewn together scraps of mouse fur for warmth. It was this pragmatism that made his empire more than just raids stretched across time. He was not content with loot. He wanted a system, laws, routes, messengers, alliances, a design strong enough to outlive him. But even systems rested on the sharp edge of fear. His campaigns taught rulers across Asia and beyond that envoys must never be harmed, that resistance must either be total or not attempted at all, and that half measures were fatal. Some rulers surrendered before a single arrow was loosed, sparing their people from slaughter. Others, blinded by pride or convinced their walls were high enough, defied him, and their cities became blackened ruins, their populations scattered to the winds. The campaign in Persia had proven the Khan's fury, but also his limits. Though victorious, he had not stayed to govern every inch of the conquered lands. He withdrew, leaving smoldering wreckage behind, as if to say, "This is what awaits you if you resist. But order will come in time." His sons, his generals, his governors would later lay the groundwork for Mongol administration in those regions. For now, the message was enough. Even as he turned east, a smaller band, no more than 20,000, under Jebei and Subutai, pushed further westward. What followed was less a campaign than a ghostly warning of what could have been. They rode through the Caucasus, broke kingdoms that thought themselves untouchable, and descended on the plains of Rus. At the Kalka River, Slavic princes marched with heavy pride, their forces confident in their armor and their god. The riders feigned weakness for 9 days, letting the Rus stretch thinner and thinner, until they were ripe for slaughter. When the trap snapped shut, the princes found themselves crushed. Some were captured alive, laid beneath wooden planks, and suffocated as Mongol victors feasted above them. It was more than death, it was humiliation. Then, just as quickly, the riders vanished eastward, a shadow disappearing into the dawn. For the Rus, it was a prophecy of what was yet to come. For the rest of Europe, it was a whisper. The storm that had consumed Asia might one day sweep across their fields. But the Khan's eyes returned to unfinished business. The Tangut, once subdued, had grown restless. They had bent the knee, yes, but obedience had faltered. In the steppe, betrayal, even hesitation, was unforgivable. In 1227, Arslan marched against them once more. His body was aging. The years of endless campaign had weighed on him, and yet the fury was undimmed. The Tangut were destroyed, their dynasty erased from the map. Their submission had been half-hearted, and half-heartedness was not tolerated. It was during this campaign that death came for Arslan himself. Accounts differ. Some say he fell from his horse. Others whisper that illness took him. Still others tell of a wound left festering from earlier battles. What is certain is that in 1227, as the walls of Tangut cities fell, the universal ruler breathed his last. But even in death, secrecy wrapped him. His body was carried back to the sacred mountain, and the escort killed every living soul they passed, villagers, travelers, anyone to preserve the secret of the burial place. To this day, no one knows where the Khan's bones rest. His tomb is the silence of the steppe itself. Yet his death did not end the storm. His sons and grandsons had been trained, blooded in war, and sharpened by his ruthless meritocracy. They carried his vision outward, further than he himself had ever gone. It was Batu, grandson of Arslan, who rode into Europe itself. In 1237, his horsemen descended on the Rus again, this time not as raiders, but as conquerors. Ryazan fell first, its people slaughtered after a 5-day siege. Vladimir followed, its churches burned, its treasures looted. Moscow, still a minor settlement, was destroyed too. By the winter of 1240, Kiev, the jewel of the Rus, faced the riders. Its proud walls crumbled under siege engines and fire. When the gates fell, Kiev was left in ashes, its people massacred or enslaved. The chronicles say bones lay in heaps taller than men. From there, Batu and Subutai turned west into Poland and Hungary. At Legnica, Polish knights charged, their heavy armor gleaming. But armor is nothing if your horse is cut from under you. Smoke bombs filled the air. The riders wheeled, drew their bows, and rained arrows into the ranks. The knights fell, their ears cut off to tally the dead 9 sacks of them. Duke Henry's severed head was shown on a spear before the city walls. 2 days later, at Mohi in Hungary, the trap was larger and more perfect. A pontoon bridge built in silence, a wagon fortress surrounded, a feigned gap left open, leading straight into the jaws of cavalry waiting in ambush. When it ended, 70,000 Hungarians lay dead. The kingdom itself collapsed in a single stroke. Panic swept across Europe. Vienna, Austria, even the Adriatic coast saw the smoke of distant fires. The Pope called for unity. Bells rang across cathedrals, and then silence. The riders withdrew, called back by the death of Ogadai Khan, son of Arslan, whose passing demanded a new council to choose a successor. Europe had been saved, not by its own strength, but by fate. Had Batu pressed forward, the world map today might bear no resemblance to what we know. Europe breathed a sigh of relief when the riders turned back. In towns and monasteries, priests preached that God himself had intervened. Chronicles called the storm a punishment sent and then withdrawn. But the truth was simpler. The empire was bound by law, even in its highest house. When a great Khan died, princes had to return to the steppe for the Kurultai, the sacred council, to choose his successor. It was duty above conquest. In Mongolia, the Kurultai crowned Guyuk, son of Ogadai. His reign was brief, cut short by illness, but it marked a turning point. The empire, now vast beyond comprehension, stretched from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to Persia. No man, no council could govern it all alone. So the realm was divided into khanates, 4 great spheres, under different branches of the family. In the west, Batu established the Golden Horde, ruling the steppes and the conquered lands of Rus. In Persia, Hulagu, another grandson, carved out the Ilkhanate, ruling from Baghdad after burning the Abbasid Caliphate to the ground in 1258. In Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate rose, and in the east, Kublai, the most ambitious of all, would soon set his eyes on China itself. But before the divisions hardened, there came a golden age, a strange and fleeting era known as the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. For the first time in memory, a traveler could ride from the Yellow Sea to the Black Sea under one authority. The Yam system post stations with fresh horses, food, and shelter stitched together the world like threads through a torn cloth. Messengers carried sealed tablets, paisas, granting them safe passage. A man could cover 250 miles in a day if the message was urgent enough. Trade caravans, once prey for bandits, moved in relative safety, guarded by the Khan's law. Merchants spoke in awe of the transformation. Where once they had paid bribes at every border, now there was only one tax, one law, one road. Spices from India, silk from China, glass from Venice, furs from Siberia, all flowed along the arteries of this empire. Scholars later said that in those days, a girl could walk with gold balanced on her head from one end of the realm to the other without being harmed. It was exaggeration, but it spoke of a truth. Law and fear had made the roads safer than ever before. And with trade came ideas. Paper money, first printed in China, spread west. Gunpowder, once only an alchemist's trick, traveled with it and would one day roar in European cannons. Knowledge from Persia and the Arab world met Chinese astronomy, Indian mathematics, Greek philosophy. The empire became a crossroads of cultures that had never before touched. In Karakoram, the Mongol capital, visitors saw a city unlike any other. Persian merchants, Chinese artisans, Russian slaves, European envoys all gathered under one roof. A French goldsmith captured during raids in Hungary crafted a fountain of silver that spouted wine and mare's milk in streams shaped like lions. It was a symbol. The steppe had not just conquered, it had collected. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. The empire was too vast, its rulers too proud, its traditions too different. Kublai, grandson of Arslan, sought to claim the mantle of Great Khan. His rival Arik Bokeh refused to bow. Their war split the empire. Though Kublai triumphed, the unity was gone. Each khanate began to walk its own path. Kublai turned his gaze to China. He declared the Yuan dynasty in 1271, ruling as an emperor, not merely a steppe conqueror. He adopted Chinese administration, Confucian advisors, and the trappings of imperial court life. His capital moved to Khanbalik, modern-day Beijing. To many Mongols, this was betrayal. The steppe abandoned for stone walls, the saddle exchanged for silk. But Kublai was determined. He pressed south against the Song dynasty, whose armies and fleets resisted for decades. Siege after siege ground on. Rivers ran with blood, cities withstood starvation. At last, in 1279, the Song fell. Iri, China, the richest land on earth, was now under Mongol rule. And yet Kublai's ambitions reached further still. He looked to the sea. Twice he sent fleets against Japan. Twice typhoons struck, scattering the ships, sinking thousands, leaving corpses drifting on foreign shores. The Japanese called the storms kamikaze divine wind, and they believed the gods themselves had protected them. Other campaigns in Southeast Asia fared little better. Vietnam's jungles swallowed Mongol cavalry. The heat, the disease, the alien terrain, these were enemies the horsemen could not master. In Java, resistance was fierce, and the riders who had swept across half the world found themselves bogged down in rain and mud. Failure gnawed at the empire's aura. For the first time, the horsemen of the steppe seemed mortal. Meanwhile, in the west, Hulagu's conquest of Baghdad had shocked the Islamic world. The Abbasid Caliphate, seat of religious authority for centuries, was obliterated in 1258. The Caliph was rolled in a carpet and trampled to death by horses. Libraries filled with centuries of knowledge were thrown into the Tigris until the river ran black with ink. For Muslims, it was a wound that never healed. But the Ilkhanate that followed gradually changed. In 1295, Genghis Khan, Hulagu's descendant, converted to Islam. From that moment, the rulers of Persia became Muslim themselves. Mosques rose, scholars wrote, and Mongol rule blended into the land it had conquered. A synthesis emerged. Persian architecture, Mongol administration, Islamic faith. The conquerors became the governed. In Russia, the Golden Horde ruled through fear and tribute. Princes traveled to Sarai, the Horde's capital, to kneel before its khans and beg for the right to rule. Among them, the princes of Moscow learned how to play the game best, gaining favor, collecting taxes for the Horde, and slowly rising above their rivals. Centuries later, it would be Moscow that broke the Horde, but only by adopting many of its methods. In Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate split in two: west, leaning toward Islam, east, clinging to steppe traditions. The division grew sharper, as if the empire itself could not decide what it wanted to be: nomadic or settled, pagan or Muslim, law of the steppe or law of the book. And then came the plague. The Black Death, born somewhere in the steppes or deserts of Central Asia, spread along the very roads the empire had secured. Rats on ships, fleas in cargo, the unseen enemy traveled faster than any horse. By the 1340s, it struck Europe, killing 1/3 of its people. In the Middle East, in China, in Central Asia, the death toll was just as devastating. The same networks that had carried silk and spices now carried death. The empire, already fragile, staggered under the weight. Rebellions flared in China, where famine and floods added to misery. The Red Turbans, a secret society, rose in arms. In 1368, the Yuan dynasty was overthrown. The last Mongol emperor fled back to the steppe, leaving China to the Ming. In Persia, the Ilkhanate collapsed after Abu Sa'id died without an heir in 1335. Fragmented states took its place, Persian in culture, but faintly stamped with Mongol heritage. The Golden Horde too began to fracture. Crimean Khanate, Kazan Khanate, Astrakhan Khanate all broke away. Moscow grew stronger. In 1480, Ivan III refused to pay tribute. At the Ugra River, the standoff ended without battle, but it ended centuries of Mongol dominance. By the 1600s, the once mighty empire was gone, broken into shards, absorbed by new powers. The Manchus swallowed Mongolia. Russia took the steppe. The Ottomans and Safavids dominated the Middle East. The dream of unity under the eternal blue sky faded. And yet, the echoes remain. Language, blood, memory. Turkic tongues spread where once Indo-European ruled. Genetic traces of Arslan's line ripple through millions today, as if the conqueror's shadow still walks. Borders of modern nations follow old Khanate lines. The Russian state, shaped by centuries of horde rule, grew into a new empire of its own. The Mughal dynasty of India carried the very name Mongol into a new world of palaces and gardens. Even in death, the Khan's empire whispered across time. The decline of the empire was not a sudden collapse, but a long twilight, a fading drumbeat echoing across the grasslands. Imagine the steppe at dusk, the horizon burning orange, the herds moving slow, the riders quiet. That was the empire in its later centuries, still vast, still feared, but no longer unstoppable. After Kublai's death in 1294, the Yuan dynasty staggered on in China. Its rulers, raised in palaces instead of tents, grew softer. They relied on ministers more than on instinct, and their subjects, millions of Han Chinese, never accepted them fully as emperors. Taxes grew heavy, floods ravaged farmland, inflation hollowed out paper currency until it became worthless. The memory of the horsemen's firepower faded, replaced by the daily resentment of a foreign court. Rebellions flared. Secret societies whispered in the shadows, passing red cloth as their sign. The red turbans gathered peasants, monks, and discontented soldiers into an army. They carried not only swords, but promises of a new dynasty, of food in the granaries, of a China free from Mongol rule. When they rose, the empire cracked. The final Yuan emperor fled Beijing in 1368, his banners trampled, his palaces abandoned. He rode north, back to the homeland of the steppe, carrying with him the last fragments of imperial dignity. In his place, the Ming dynasty rose, strong and fiercely Chinese, determined to erase the memory of foreign rulers. Yet the Ming kept much of what the Mongols had built: postal stations, military organization, even the walls they repaired and strengthened into what later generations would call the Great Wall. In Persia, the Ilkhanate had already splintered. Abu Sa'id's death without an heir left a vacuum. Generals, governors, and warlords carved up territories. Cities that had once hosted Mongol courts turned inward, ruled by Persians again, though still echoing with the influence of their conquerors. Persian art bloomed in this period, illuminated manuscripts, new architectural wonders, histories written in flowing Arabic script. Ironically, the memory of destruction gave way to a flowering of creation. But it was in Central Asia and Russia that the Mongol story lingered longest. The Golden Horde, seated at Sarai on the Volga, continued to dominate the Rus for centuries. The princes of Moscow traveled there with tribute, kneeling before khans, receiving written charters that confirmed their right to rule. In that submission, Moscow learned the habits of empire: centralized authority, ruthless tax collection, iron discipline. These lessons would outlast the horde itself, shaping the Muscovite state into a power that would one day conquer the conquerors. The horde fractured over time. The Crimean Khanate allied with the Ottomans. Kazan and Astrakhan became their own realms, sometimes fighting each other, sometimes resisting Moscow. Siberian Khanates held onto the forests and rivers of the north, but the tide of history had turned. In 1480, Ivan III of Moscow refused to pay tribute. At the Ugra River, Russian and Mongol forces faced each other. No battle was fought. The standoff ended with retreat. It was called the Great Stand on the Ugra, and it marked the end of Mongol rule in Russia. The shadow lifted, though its shape remained stamped in the land. The steppe itself did not remain empty. Other powers rose. The Timurids, descendants not by blood, but by ambition, rebuilt fragments of empire. Timur, or Tamerlane, as later generations called him, claimed connection to the old Khans by marriage. He gathered armies of steppe riders and marched again into Persia, India, and Syria. His cruelty rivaled even the early Mongols. In Delhi, he stacked skulls in pyramids. In Baghdad, he repeated Hulagu's massacre. Yet Timur's empire, like a flame in the wind, burned hot and brief. By 1405, with his death, it scattered. Still, echoes of the Mongols lived on. In India, Babur, a descendant of Timur and of Genghis Khan through his mother, founded the Mughal Empire in 1526. The very name Mughal carried the Mongol legacy forward. But here, the empire was no longer nomadic. It was a dynasty of palaces, gardens, marble tombs, and art that blended Persian, Indian, and steppe traditions. From Delhi to Agra, the Mongol shadow took on new colors. Elsewhere, the Ottoman Empire rose in Anatolia, inheriting tactics and administration partly shaped by Mongol precedents. In Persia, the Safavids established a Shia dynasty, consolidating power in the vacuum left by the Ilkhanate. And in China, the Ming continued to grapple with the northern frontier, forever wary of the horsemen beyond the wall. But the steppe, the original heart, was changing. The climate cooled, grass thinned. The Little Ice Age gnawed at the land that had once supported millions of horses. Without the herds, the riders could not live as they had. Without the riders, the steppe could not project its power. By the 17th century, the Oirat Mongols briefly built one last nomadic confederation, the Dzungar Khanate. But even they were crushed by the Qing dynasty of China. The eternal blue sky still stretched over Mongolia, but beneath it, the empire was gone. And yet, in ways subtle and invisible, it lived on. Genetics tell a story the chronicles only hint at. Across Asia, from the Caspian to the Pacific, millions of men carry a Y chromosomal lineage traced back to a single ancestor of the 12th century. Scholars call it the Genghis Khan effect. By conquest, by power, by sheer reach, his line spread into countless families. Today, 1 in 200 men may carry the blood of the Khan. Languages shifted too. Turkic tongues spread across Central Asia, displacing older languages. Russian absorbed Mongol loanwords in politics and war. Persian and Arabic texts recorded Mongol conquests in grim detail, shaping historical memory. Even in China, the Yuan left marks on literature, drama, and administration that lingered long after their dynasty fell. And the idea of empire itself vast, mobile, bound by law and loyalty rather than bloodlines left a lasting mark. The Russians, the Ottomans, the Mughals all inherited fragments of Mongol practice. The very notion that trade could flow across thousands of miles under one authority foreshadowed the modern world economy. The Pax Mongolica was brief, but it was a prototype of globalization. Even today, Mongolia remembers. In Ulaanbaatar, statues of the Great Khan tower over squares. Streets, airports, and vodka bottles bear his name. For Mongolians, he is not just a conqueror, but the father of a nation, proof that from poverty and abandonment can rise power that shakes the world. For others, memory is darker. In Persia, the Mongols are remembered as destroyers of irrigation and libraries. In Russia, as the yoke that bent their backs for centuries. in China as foreign rulers who taxed and divided. Every land touched by the horsemen carries a scar, whether of pride or of pain. And somewhere in Mongolia, beneath an unmarked patch of earth, lies the tomb of the man who began it all. No one knows where. Some say the burial escort killed thousands to keep it secret. Some say the horses trampled the ground until no trace remained. Some say it was hidden in the sacred mountains, where the spirits themselves guard it. The silence is fitting. For a man who reshaped half the world, mystery is the truest monument. So when you look at a map, when you trace the borders of modern nations, when you study the languages and cultures of Eurasia, remember this. Much of what you see carries the fingerprints of that boy born clutching a blood clot, abandoned by his clan, raised on roots and mouse skins. His life was a storm. His empire a shadow that still falls across us. The hoofbeats have faded, but their echo remains. Centuries after the thunder of hooves faded, the world still felt the tremor. To walk through the ruins of Samarkand, to stand by the Volga where Sarai once bustled, or to trace the broken canals of Persia, all of it whispered of a time when one man's vision bound half the earth under the eternal blue sky. But decline was never simple. It was not only enemies that brought the empire down, it was success itself. The empire had grown so vast that it became a mirror of every land it ruled. In Persia, Mongol Khans prayed in mosques. In China, they wore silk robes and spoke Mandarin. In Russia, they collected tribute through Slavic princes. In India, their descendants built marble tombs like the Taj Mahal. The conquerors dissolved into the conquered. And perhaps this was the fate they could never escape, to win so thoroughly that they erased the very distinction between themselves and their enemies. Take the Yuan dynasty in China. Kublai Khan had ruled with brilliance, but his successors stumbled. They sat in palaces with lacquered screens, more concerned with luxury than with the saddle. Courtiers whispered, eunuchs schemed, and ministers carried the weight of government, while Mongol emperors grew distant. By the 1350s, famine and plague tore through northern China. Crops failed. The Yellow River flooded and shifted course, drowning villages and leaving others dry. Paper money, once a marvel, became worthless as each new emperor printed more. The Red Turban rebels rose in this chaos. They were not a single movement, but a tide of desperate farmers, monks, and warriors bound by the belief that the mandate of heaven had passed. They carried flags dyed with blood and prophecy, and their armies swelled like rivers after rain. For years they fought city by city until the Yuan crumbled. In 1368, the Ming dynasty took Beijing, and the last Yuan emperor fled north, his empire reduced to memory. Yet even in defeat, the Mongol presence lingered. The Ming rebuilt, but they kept the postal relay system, the emphasis on centralized command, and the constant vigilance toward the north. The Great Wall itself, in its later stone form, was built in large part to keep out what remained of the steppe riders. The Mongols were gone as rulers, but not as a threat. In Persia, the Ilkhanate's collapse left a patchwork of states, each rising and falling like waves. But the cultural synthesis they had sparked endured. Persian miniatures paintings on paper glowing with Chinese landscapes and Mongol hunting scenes flourished in this period. Historians like Rashid al-Din compiled universal chronicles, blending sources from China, India, Persia, and Europe into a single narrative. Such works would never have existed without the empire's vast reach. Even destruction birthed knowledge. In Russia, the Golden Horde's shadow lasted longest. For 2 centuries, the princes of Moscow knelt in Sarai, carrying gifts of silver and furs, begging for charters that allowed them to rule. The horde was brutal, but it was also orderly. Taxes were counted, punishments exacted, tribute collected with precision. Moscow learned this language of power and made it its own. When Ivan III finally defied the horde in 1480, standing by the Ugra River, he was not merely resisting, he was replacing. The Muscovite state became, in many ways, a mirror of the horde, centralized, autocratic, relentless. Russia was shaped as much by Mongol dominance as by Orthodox faith. Further east, the Chagatai Khanate fractured into rival states. Some leaned toward Islam, others clung to shamanism and the old ways. In the west, their lands fell under Timur, the warlord who styled himself heir to both Genghis and Alexander. His empire was as bloody as it was short-lived. He built pyramids of skulls in Delhi and Aleppo, reminders that cruelty still had currency. Yet his descendants carried the Mongol torch into India, founding the Mughal dynasty. There, the nomadic conqueror's blood mixed with Persian art and Indian culture, leaving behind not skulls, but monuments like the Taj Mahal, a mausoleum that glitters white in the sun, yet is still, at its heart, a legacy of Mongol ambition. But even as successor states rose and fell, the steppe itself was changing. The climate cooled. The Little Ice Age shortened grazing seasons. Herds shrank, and with them the riders' strength. Firearms spread across Eurasia, brought west through the very trade routes the Mongols had opened. The composite bow, once unstoppable, was matched and then surpassed by muskets and cannons. What had been revolutionary became obsolete. The age of the horse archer gave way to the age of gunpowder. The Mongols who remained in their homeland turned inward. The northern Yuan held on in Mongolia for centuries, dreaming of reconquest, raiding Ming territory, clashing with Manchu tribes, but each generation grew weaker. By the 17th century, the Manchu themselves rose, uniting tribes of Northeast Asia and sweeping south to conquer China, establishing the Qing dynasty. The Mongols, once masters of empires, became subjects. And yet the echo continued. Genetics carried it, histories recorded it, languages preserved it, and monuments scattered across continents bore silent witness. Stand in Samarkand today, among the turquoise domes and tiled madrasas built by Timur's descendants, and you see Persian, Islamic, and Mongol influence intertwined. Walk the streets of Moscow, and you feel the autocracy that once bent to Sarai. Travel the Silk Road, now paved highways, and you trace paths first secured by Mongol patrols. Even the idea of global trade, of a world bound together by roads, relays, and law, found its first true form under their watch. What then is the legacy of the boy born with a blood clot in his hand? He was a destroyer, yes. Cities burned, millions died, civilizations crumbled at his command. Persian chroniclers called him a monster, a punishment sent by heaven. Chinese histories remembered him as both conqueror and unifier. Russians cursed the Tatar yoke. But he was also a builder. He forged laws that bound tribes into a state. He created systems of communication, merit, and reward that shattered aristocratic hierarchies. He opened the roads that carried silk, spices, paper, and gunpowder from one end of the world to the other. He proved that birth was less important than loyalty, that skill mattered more than name. In his ruthless way, he offered opportunity where before there had been only walls. And so his story remains a paradox. To some a monster, to others a genius, to all a force that reshaped the world. His tomb has never been found. Legends say his escort killed every living thing they passed to keep it secret. Horses trampled the earth until no trace remained. Some believe it lies in the sacred mountains, guarded by spirits. Others whisper it is hidden beneath rivers, forests, or fields, waiting for a day when it will be uncovered. But perhaps the truest tomb is not in the earth at all. It is in memory, in language, in the borders of nations, in the blood of millions alive today. Close your eyes and you can almost hear it. The thunder of hooves across the steppe, the whistle of arrows in the wind, the crack of ice under winter skies. A boy abandoned by his clan, a man who rose above every rival, a ruler who dreamed not just of conquest but of unity. His empire has faded, but his echo endures. And the echo reminds us that the world we know, our maps, our languages, our very lives still carry the hoofprints of the greatest land empire ever forged. The hoofbeats may have faded centuries ago, but listen closely, they are still there, echoing beneath the soil of Eurasia. When the wind sweeps across the steppes, when dust lifts from the earth in sudden storms, it carries the memory of riders who once moved faster than thought itself. They were a storm, and though the storm is gone, the air still remembers. Even the scars they left became seeds of something new. Where canals had been broken in Persia, villages eventually returned. Where Baghdad's libraries had been drowned in the Tigris, scholars in distant lands carried fragments of that knowledge elsewhere. The Mongol hand smashed, but it also scattered, and in scattering, it ensured that nothing could remain contained. Ideas, technologies, even diseases traveled because the empire had made the world one long, dangerous road. Consider Europe. In the 13th century, it was still a patchwork of kingdoms, often isolated, often provincial. The Mongol invasion of Hungary and Poland terrified them, and then the retreat left them with a strange gift: contact. Traders, diplomats, even missionaries began making the journey east. They carried home reports of silk-wrapped cities, gunpowder weapons, and strange currencies of paper that bore the Great Khan's seal. These reports, shocking as they were, widened Europe's view of the world. Without the Mongols, perhaps Marco Polo would never have reached China, never carried back tales that stirred the imagination of explorers like Columbus. In this way, the empire shaped events long after its political body had collapsed. The age of exploration, the rise of global trade, even the spread of the Renaissance all carried faint fingerprints of the empire's legacy. A network of roads and relays had turned Eurasia into a single system, and though that system broke apart, its memory lingered. Others tried to rebuild it in different forms. Even centuries later, rulers invoked the name of the Khan to claim legitimacy. Timur traced his line, however tenuously, to the conqueror's blood. Babur, founder of the Mughal dynasty, carried both Timurid and Mongol ancestry. His descendants would rule India for centuries, leaving monuments like the Red Fort and the Taj Mahal. The very word Mughal preserved the shadow of the steppe. In Russia, Ivan the Terrible modeled his autocracy on both Byzantine and Mongol patterns. The Russian Tsars inherited more than just land. They inherited a mindset of absolute rule that had once belonged to the Khans. When Moscow expanded east into Siberia, it was as if the empire had reversed itself, the former subjects becoming conquerors, pushing across the same steppes their ancestors had once feared. And in China, though the Yuan had fallen, Mongol influence persisted. The Ming studied their cavalry tactics. The Qing, themselves outsiders from Manchuria, built alliances with Mongol tribes and eventually absorbed their lands. The Great Wall, rebuilt and extended, stood less as a monument to Chinese pride than as a permanent scar of fear, a reminder that the riders might one day return. But they never did. The age of horses and bows was over. Firearms, fortresses, and new powers ruled the world. The blue sky still arched over Mongolia, vast and eternal. But beneath it, herds grew smaller, tribes more divided, influence more limited. The land that had once produced an empire became a frontier, fought over by neighbors far stronger. Yet the memory remained, even when the power was gone. Mongolian herders told tales of the great Khan by the fireside. Persian poets wrote laments of the cities lost. Russian chronicles spoke of the yoke that bent their fathers' necks. Chinese histories recorded both the devastation and the strange unity. Every land touched by the empire remembered it differently, some with pride, others with bitterness, many with awe. And perhaps that is the truest measure of its scale. No one who lived under its shadow forgot it. The final mystery is the Khan himself. His tomb has never been found. Legends say his funeral escort killed every living thing they passed, so that no witness survived. Others claim the ground was trampled by horses until the burial site vanished. Some say rivers were diverted to cover it, or that the mountain itself closed around him. Wherever he rests, the silence holds. No monument, no stone, no inscription marks his grave. And yet, does he need one? His true monument is larger than stone. It is in the borders of nations, in the languages we speak, in the blood of millions alive today who unknowingly carry his line. It is in the roads that became trade routes, in the empires that copied his laws, in the cities that rebuilt themselves after his fire. His tomb is not one place. It is everywhere. Imagine standing on the Mongolian steppe tonight. The sky stretches endless, the stars sharp and cold. The wind cuts across the grass, the same wind that once filled the lungs of riders who carried empires on their saddles. You close your eyes, and for a moment you hear it, the drumbeat of hooves, the creak of leather, the whistle of arrows. They are not here, but they are not gone. For history is not just past, it is presence. It lingers quiet, but unyielding. The boy born clutching a blood clot became the man who united the tribes, who shattered kingdoms, who opened roads across continents. He was both scourge and statesman, both destroyer and creator. He built the largest contiguous land empire in human history, and though it fell, its echo endures. The hoofbeats fade into silence, the stars wheel overhead, and still the echo carries across time, across continents, across us.